What if the Roman Empire never fell? What if Rome had survived the barbarian invasions, held onto its western provinces, and continued ruling Europe for centuries? If that happened, the entire course of world history would change beyond recognition. No medieval Europe as we know it, no scattered kingdoms fighting over the ruins of a fallen empire, no long age of fragmentation, feudalism, and constant border wars. Instead, one immense imperial system would continue dominating the Mediterranean world, holding together the political, cultural, and military center of Europe. And that raises the real question: if Rome never collapsed, what kind of world would follow? Would humanity become more advanced faster? Would religion take a different path? Would modern nations even exist? Or would the world still be living under the shadow of Caesar? To understand this alternate timeline, we need to go back to the moment when Rome was weakest. The Western Roman Empire was under enormous pressure. Germanic tribes were crossing the borders. The army was stretched thin. The economy was unstable. Corruption and internal conflict weakened the state from within. In our timeline, the empire eventually broke apart. But in this version of history, something changes just enough to stop the collapse. Maybe the emperors reform the army earlier. Maybe they stabilize the economy before it is too late. Maybe Rome reaches a settlement with the invading tribes instead of losing control. Maybe one strong ruler appears at the right moment and keeps the empire together. However it happens, the result is the same. The Western Empire survives, and that survival changes everything. Instead of Europe falling into centuries of political fragmentation, the Roman state remains the dominant force across the continent. Cities do not shrink as much. Trade routes remain active. Roads are maintained. Imperial administration stays in place. The collapse that created the Middle Ages never fully happens. That means no dramatic reset, no complete loss of central authority, no centuries where local lords and regional warlords replace a unified state. At first, this might seem like a better world, and in some ways, it would be. A surviving Rome would likely preserve law, infrastructure, literacy, and commerce much more effectively than the broken post-Roman kingdoms of our own timeline. The empire would continue collecting taxes, maintaining armies, and coordinating trade across a huge territory. But there is another side to that stability. A giant empire can preserve civilization, but it can also freeze it. The stronger the central system, the harder it becomes for new ideas, institutions, and identities to emerge. In a world where Rome never falls, the rise of separate European nations might never happen in the same way. There may be no France, no Germany, no Italy as independent modern states, at least not for a very long time. Instead, people would still think of themselves first as subjects of the empire. That would reshape identity itself. In our world, the fall of Rome helped create the conditions for local cultures and regional powers to grow. Language changed, borders shifted, new kingdoms emerged. Over time, those kingdoms became nations. But if Rome remains intact, the imperial identity stays stronger than the local one. The world becomes less divided, but also less varied. Religion would also take a very different path. In our timeline, Christianity became deeply connected to Rome, then later to the medieval church, the papacy, and the struggle between religious and secular power. But if the Roman state remains strong, the church may never become an institution separate from imperial control. The emperor could shape doctrine, appoint religious leaders, and tightly control the spread of Christianity. That means no medieval power struggle between pope and emperor in the way we know it. No massive conflict between church and state across Europe. No fully independent papal system becoming one of the great political forces of the Middle Ages. Instead, religion may remain a branch of the state, one more tool of imperial unity, and that would have enormous consequences. Because once Rome controls both politics and religion, it controls the foundation of civilization itself. The empire would not just be a military power. It would be a cultural and spiritual order. That kind of structure could last for a very long time, but it could also become rigid and resistant to reform. Now let's think about technology and knowledge. One of the biggest losses after Rome's fall in our timeline was the disruption of administration, engineering, and communication. A surviving empire could preserve large-scale infrastructure much better. Roads might remain in use. Ports and aqueducts might continue functioning. Cities could stay bigger. Bureaucracy might remain highly organized. That would allow knowledge to survive more continuously than it did in our world. Engineering would not have to be rediscovered in quite the same way. Ancient texts might remain more accessible. The connection between classical learning and later scientific development could be much stronger. But again, this does not automatically mean progress would be faster. A huge empire is efficient, but it can also be conservative. Rome might preserve old knowledge while discouraging radical change. The empire could value order over experimentation. It could encourage stability over invention. And so the world might remain advanced in some areas, but slower to transform in others. That is one of the great paradoxes of imperial survival. It protects civilization, but it can also limit the kind of disruption that produces breakthroughs. Now let's move beyond Europe. If Rome survives as a major power, the entire Mediterranean world changes. North Africa may stay more closely tied to the empire. The Balkans may remain firmly Roman. The Middle East would face a much stronger Western power, and that affects the rise of later religions, empires, and trade networks. Islam, for example, could still emerge in Arabia. But if Rome is far stronger than the weakened empire of our timeline, the expansion of early Islamic states might be met with a very different opponent. The borders between Christian and Islamic civilization could end up in another place entirely. Spain, Sicily, North Africa, the Levant, and the Eastern Mediterranean might all follow new historical paths. That means no familiar medieval world map, no clear line between a Roman West and a fragmented post-Roman Europe, no simple rise of successor kingdoms taking over the ruins of empire. Instead, the Roman world remains the center of gravity, and everything around it must adapt. This also changes trade and exploration. A unified empire across the Mediterranean could make long-distance trade safer and more predictable. Goods, ideas, and people would move more easily. The empire might become a huge economic engine linking Europe, Africa, and Asia. If that happens, the age of discovery might develop differently. European exploration beyond the known world could be delayed, accelerated, or redirected, depending on how Rome manages its economy and borders. And if the empire is rich enough, it may not feel the same need to expand outward the way later kingdoms did. This is where alternate history becomes especially interesting. In our timeline, the fall of Rome created the conditions for competition. Competition led to fragmentation, and fragmentation eventually led to innovation, nationalism, colonial expansion, and modern geopolitics. But if Rome survives, that whole process is disrupted. There may be fewer rival powers, fewer constant wars between small states, fewer opportunities for ambitious nobles and kings to build separate kingdoms. That could mean a more stable world, but also a less dynamic one. Now imagine the Renaissance. Would it still happen? Maybe, but not in the same way. The Renaissance in our timeline was partly a rebirth of classical learning after a long period of fragmentation. But if Rome never fell, then classical learning never disappears in the first place. There is no dramatic rediscovery of ancient knowledge because the ancient world never fully ends. That means the Renaissance might become something else entirely. It might be less a rebirth and more a continuation. Instead of rediscovering Rome, people would still be living inside a Roman civilization that is never stopped. That sounds powerful, but it also means the emotional contrast that shaped Europe's cultural awakening would be gone. The world would never experience the same shock of "we are building something new on the ruins of the old," because there would be no ruins. And that brings us to nationalism. Modern nationalism emerged after centuries of shifting identities, local loyalties, and the decline of universal empires. But if Rome remains dominant for so long, national identity may never become the central political force it became in our world. People could remain loyal to the empire for generations, even centuries. Language differences might still exist, but they would exist under a single imperial framework. That would change everything from law to warfare to diplomacy. Instead of competing nations, the world might consist of one enormous imperial core and many dependent regions around it. The modern idea of borders, citizenship, and sovereignty might never fully develop in the same way. Europe could remain a civilization of provinces rather than states. So would the world be better if you value order, continuity, and stability? Then a surviving Roman Empire looks impressive. It could preserve infrastructure, culture, and administration at a level unmatched for centuries. It might prevent much of the chaos that followed Rome's collapse. But if you value diversity, political innovation, and the rise of independent societies, then this world may feel restricted. Fewer nations, less freedom for rival systems to emerge, more imperial control, less historical variety. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of this scenario. Rome did not just hold Europe together. It also set the stage for everything that came after its fall. The medieval kingdoms, the church, the nation-states, the age of discovery, and even the modern world all grew partly because Rome was gone. Remove that collapse, and you do not just get a stronger empire. You get a different civilization. One where the line between ancient and modern never quite exists. One where Caesar's shadow stretches much farther than it ever did in our timeline. One where the world may still be asking the same question: how long can an empire last before history finally changes it?